The Lonely Rancher. The sun, a molten disk in a hazy sky, beat down on Jedediah Stone's ranch. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, clinging to the weathered planks of the barn and settling on the broad brim of Jed's hat. He swung the axe with a practiced rhythm, each strike biting deep into the thick oak log, splitting it clean with a satisfying crack. Buster, his grizzled hound, lay in the sliver of shade cast by the woodpile, a low growl rumbling in his chest as a persistent fly buzzed near his nose. The only other sounds were the distant call of a hawk and the gentle creak of the windmill, perpetually turning, perpetually alone. Jed was a man of few words, and on his spread, there was rarely anyone to speak them to. His days were a quiet testament to hard work, mending fences, tending to the scrawny herd, keeping the persistent wilderness at bay. He found a grim satisfaction in the labor, a way to anchor himself against the vast, empty sky and the deeper emptiness within. Loneliness was a constant companion, a silent weight that had settled upon him like the dust on his land. Later, as the sun dipped, painting the horizon in hues of orange and purple, Jed rode into town for supplies. The general store, usually a hub of quiet commerce, buzzed with an unusual energy. Old Man Hemlock, the proprietor, leaned over the counter, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Heard tell about that auction next week, Jed?" he asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and unease. Jed grunted, picking up a sack of flour. "Heard something," he drawled, his voice rough from disuse. "They're selling her, Jed. The Apache girl. The giant one." Hemlock lowered his voice further, as if the very walls had ears. "The one folks are sayin' is cursed, a monster even." Jed paused, his hand hovering over a tin of coffee. Whispers about the girl had been circulating for weeks, grotesque tales of her immense size and supposed ferocity. He'd dismissed most of it as idle gossip, the fear of the unknown twisting into monstrous fables. Yet, the persistent hum of the town's morbid curiosity was undeniable. Back on the ranch, with Buster curled at his feet and the only light emanating from a single lantern, Jed couldn't shake the news. The wind whistled through the gaps in the cabin walls, a mournful sound that mirrored the unease in his heart. A giant Apache girl. Cursed. A monster. He pictured her, not as the terrifying caricature painted by the town, but as a human being, alone and vulnerable, about to be paraded for sale. A wave of profound pity washed over him, unsettling the quiet resolve of his solitary life. The auction wasn't just an event, it felt like a reckoning, a disturbance in the dust-laden peace of his existence. A strange pull. The worn leather of Jed's saddlebag creaked under his hand as he cinched the last buckle. Inside, a meager supply of jerky, a flask of water, and a few silver dollars rattled softly. He wasn't sure why he was bothering. Town was a place he typically avoided like a rattler's den, too many eyes, too many whispers, too many reminders of a world that had little use for a man like him. Yet, an insistent, almost physical tug pulled at him, a strange current in the quiet morning air that promised something significant. He paused, his gaze drifting over the familiar lines of his small cabin, the stable, the rugged expanse of his land stretching towards the distant peaks. For years, this solitude had been his refuge, a balm for the scars of a judgmental world. He remembered the last time he'd ventured into Harmony, a year ago for supplies. The stares had been palpable, the hushed conversations dying as he passed, only to resume with renewed fervor once he was out of earshot. It was a familiar pattern, one he had learned to live with by simply not being there. But today was different. This pull wasn't the nagging necessity of a broken plow or an empty larder. This was something deeper, a whisper of destiny that tickled the edges of his usually unshakable practicality. It felt important. He couldn't shake the image of the auction flyer he'd glimpsed on the general store's board weeks ago, a cattle auction, it had said. Not that he needed cattle. But the word auction resonated with an unexpected weight. With a sigh that was more resignation than reluctance, Jed slung the saddlebag over his shoulder. Buster, his sturdy sorrel, whickered softly as Jed approached. The horse seemed to sense the unusual journey ahead, his ears twitching with mild curiosity. "All right, old friend," Jed murmured, patting Buster's warm neck. "Looks like we're heading to town." The sun was climbing, casting long shadows across the dusty trail as they set off. The rhythmic thump of Buster's hooves against the earth was the only sound for a long while, a comforting counterpoint to the growing unease in Jed's gut. He still couldn't articulate why he was going, only that he had to. It was a compulsion, a strange, undeniable current guiding him towards harmony, towards whatever waited for him there. The auction square. The dust of the trail still clung to Jed's boots as he rode into Prosperity Gulch. It was a town aptly named, though the prosperity seemed to belong solely to the men gathered in the square today, their faces a mix of morbid curiosity and outright hostility. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and something else, a prickle of tension that made the hairs on Jed's arms stand up. His gaze swept over the crowd, a sea of worn hats and suspicious eyes. They muttered amongst themselves, their voices a low, guttural hum that only occasionally broke into a sharp, venomous word. He dismounted, tethering his horse to a post on the edge of the square, keeping to the periphery. His presence, quiet and unassuming, went largely unnoticed amidst the spectacle. All eyes were fixed on the center, where a makeshift platform had been erected. And there she was. She stood taller than most of the men in the crowd, her frame lean and sinewy, not from starvation, but from a lifetime of movement and resilience. Her dark hair, braided with a few simple feathers, framed a face that was a study in defiance. Her cheekbones were sharp, her jaw set, and her lips, though pressed into a thin line, hinted at a strength that refused to be broken. But it was her eyes that held Jed's attention. They were black, deep pools that seemed to absorb the hostility around her and reflect it back, unwavering. They held no fear, only a profound weariness and a burning, untamed spirit. "Look at the savage," someone spat from the crowd, a man with a stained beard and a sneer. "Wild as a cougar." Another chimed in, "Heard she fought off 3 men just getting her here. Cost old Peterson an arm and a leg." A rough chuckle followed. Luna, for Jed knew instinctively this was Luna, didn't flinch. She simply stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the squalor of the town, beyond the cruelty of the men surrounding her. Her worn buckskin dress, simple and practical, spoke of a life lived close to the earth, a world far removed from the greed and prejudice that now held her captive. She carried herself with an unspoken dignity, a silent challenge to anyone who dared to try and diminish her. Jed felt a familiar ache in his chest, a quiet empathy for the solitary figure who stood so utterly alone, yet so completely unbroken. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice, now stepped forward, his mallet poised. $1. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas with a perpetually red face, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. His voice, usually a booming instrument, was strained, bordering on a whine. "All right, folks, let's get this moving. We have, this fine specimen here. Strong build, good teeth, a real worker, I tell ya." He gestured vaguely towards Luna, who stood stoically beside the makeshift stage, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with an unnerving intensity. A hush had fallen over the assembly, thick with apprehension. A nervous cough rippled through the onlookers. Whispers, sharp as flint chips, began to circulate. "Looks like a wildcat, I tell ya. Heard she tore a man's arm clean off. The spirits follow her, mark my words." Fear, a potent poison, seeped into every corner of the dusty square. No one met Luna's gaze directly, instead casting furtive glances, their expressions a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. Silas clapped his hands together, forcing a jovial tone that sounded remarkably hollow. "Come on, now. Let's get a starting bid. Who'll give me $5? $5 for this capable individual?" The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken. Silas's smile faltered. $3? Anyone? Two? His eyes darted desperately across the faces, finding only averted gazes and rigid shoulders. The air crackled with unspoken prejudice. From the back of the small crowd, Jedediah Stone stepped forward. His gait was unhurried, his posture straight, cutting through the hushed anxiety like a well-aimed arrow. He wore his usual worn leather and homespun, smelling faintly of horses and earth. As he moved, a path seemed to open for him, not out of respect, but out of the crowd's collective hesitation to impede his progress. Luna's eyes, which had remained impassive, narrowed fractionally as he approached. Jed stopped directly in front of the stage, his gaze meeting Silas's, then shifting to Luna. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the coiled strength in her shoulders, the defiance in her dark eyes. He saw resilience, not the monstrousness the townsfolk imagined. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a single silver coin. The clink of it against his palm was surprisingly loud in the oppressive silence. His voice, though quiet, carried an unexpected resonance. $1. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Silas's jaw dropped, and even Luna's composed features showed a flicker of surprise. The townsfolk stared, mouths agape, at the unassuming rancher who dared to break the spell of fear with such a paltry, yet profound, offering. The journey home. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, ripped through the dusty air of Havenwood's town square. It wasn't a roar of outrage, but a stunned exhalation, 100 individual breaths catching in 100 throats. Jedediah Stone, his jaw set, turned from the auctioneer's bewildered face, his eyes finding Luna's. Her expression remained unreadable, a mask of stoic defiance that had not wavered throughout the humiliating spectacle. Yet, a flicker, almost imperceptible, passed through her dark eyes as their gazes met. Without a word, Jed reached for the rope that still bound her wrists, his touch surprisingly gentle as he untied the rough knots. The crowd watched, frozen, as the rope fell, coiling in the dirt like a discarded snake. Luna's shoulders remained square, her chin held high, even as the whispers began to rise, a low, venomous hum from the townsfolk. Jed didn't acknowledge them. He simply turned, gesturing subtly towards his waiting horse. Luna hesitated for a fraction of a second, then followed, her movements fluid and silent despite the shackles of prejudice that still clung to her. She mounted the extra horse Jed had brought, settling into the saddle with an innate grace that belied her recent ordeal. The reins felt foreign in her hands, but she gripped them firmly. The journey began in a profound silence, broken only by the rhythmic thud of hooves on the sun-baked earth and the occasional creak of saddle leather. The town quickly receded behind them, its judgmental stares replaced by the vast, open expanse of the prairie. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the landscape in hues of orange and purple. Jed rode slightly ahead, his silhouette stark against the horizon. He didn't look back, but Luna felt his awareness of her, a silent tether between them. She studied the broad expanse of his back, the way his shoulders moved with the horse, the quiet competency of him. Her own gaze swept across the endless plains, a wild freedom in the air that began to soothe the sting of the day's indignities. Hours passed. The initial wariness between them was a tangible presence, a thin veil woven of unspoken questions and past hurts. Jed offered no explanation, no assurances. Luna asked for none. The only communication was the shared rhythm of their horses, a slow, deliberate march away from the clamor of human judgment and towards the unknown quietude of Jed's ranch. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. The stars, one by one, began to prick the darkening sky, guiding their silent passage home. A quiet welcome. The scent of wood smoke and something savory pulled Luna from the haze of her exhaustion. Jed, his back to her, stirred a pot hanging over a low fire in the hearth. He didn't look at her when he placed a chipped enamel plate of stew and a tin cup of water on the rough-hewn table. "Eat," he rumbled, his voice a low growl, devoid of either warmth or malice. Luna's stomach clenched with a hunger she hadn't fully acknowledged. She eyed the food, then Jed, who had resumed his quiet tending of the fire. The stew was thick with bits of venison and root vegetables, steaming gently. The water was cool, tasting faintly of the well. She ate slowly, every bite a small victory against the gnawing emptiness. Jed moved about the cabin, methodically tidying, his movements economical and silent. He replaced a loose shingle on the roof, mended a broken latch on a cupboard, all without a single word to her. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. Luna watched him through the open door as he tended to a lone mare in the small corral. His hands, though calloused and strong, were surprisingly gentle as he brushed the animal's coat. He spoke to the horse in a low murmur, a stark contrast to his silence with her. The mare nickered softly, nudging his shoulder. A pang, not of envy, but of a quiet curiosity, stirred within Luna. He treated the animal with a respect she hadn't encountered from many men. As dusk deepened, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jed returned to the cabin. He gestured towards a narrow cot in the corner, covered with a thick, patched quilt. "Sleep," he said, his eyes briefly meeting hers. They held no judgment, only a deep, weary understanding that mirrored her own. Luna lay on the cot, the unfamiliar softness beneath her a strange comfort. The rhythmic creak of Jed's rocking chair by the dying fire was the only sound. His silhouette, hunched in thought, was a steady, unthreatening presence. For the first time in a long while, the gnawing anxiety that had been her constant companion began to recede. The silence wasn't empty, it was a quiet space, a fragile shelter in a world that had offered her none. She closed her eyes, sleep finally claiming her in the peaceful quiet of Jedediah Stone's lonely ranch. Strength and silence. The sun, a fiery orb, was already climbing high when Jed pointed to the fallen section of fence. The winter winds had been particularly harsh, snapping the thick lodgepole pine like a twig. It was a two-man job, at least, to wrangle the heavy timber back into place and secure the barbed wire. Jed grabbed one end, grunting with effort as he tried to hoist it. Luna, without a word, approached the other end. He expected her to struggle, perhaps need him to adjust his grip. Instead, with a fluid, almost graceful motion, she lifted her side. Her muscles, taut and defined beneath the worn fabric of her dress, bunched and released with an astonishing ease. The rough bark of the pine seemed to settle into her hands as if it belonged there. Jed blinked, momentarily thrown by her effortless strength. He adjusted his own stance, suddenly feeling less capable in comparison. They worked in a rhythm born not of conversation, but of shared purpose. Jed hammered new staples, his blows ringing out sharply against the metal. Luna, with a precision that belied her lack of experience with such tools, unspooled rolls of wire, her fingers nimble and strong as she stretched it taut. He'd glance at her, a silent query in his eyes about the tension, and she'd give a subtle nod, or a fractional shake of her head, indicating more or less. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the snort of a distant horse, and the persistent hum of cicadas in the dry grass. Later, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, they sat by the small creek that snaked through Jed's land. Jed pulled out his worn tobacco pouch, carefully rolling a cigarette. He offered her one, a silent gesture of inclusion. Luna declined with a soft wave of her hand, instead reaching for a smooth, flat stone by the water's edge. She began to trace intricate patterns on its surface with her thumb, her gaze distant, lost in the movement. Jed watched her, the quiet drone of the crickets filling the space between them. He noticed the way the light caught the faint scar above her left eyebrow, a thin line almost invisible unless the angle was just right. It was a small detail, a silent story etched into her skin, and he found himself wondering about its origin, a curiosity sparked not by words, but by the quiet observation of shared time. The silence between them had begun to feel less like a void and more like a space where a different kind of understanding could grow. The howling storm. The sky, a bruised purple an hour ago, ripped open with a sound like tearing canvas. Rain, cold and driven, began to lash the ranch house and outbuildings with an almost malevolent force. Jed, securing the last shutter on the kitchen window, felt the old timbers groan under the assault. The wind, a hungry beast, howled its arrival, rattling the panes and whistling through every crevice. He glanced towards the barn, a dark silhouette against the tumultuous sky. "Luna," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the din. She was already there, a sturdy figure wrestling with the main barn door that had, moments before, been latched but not fully secured. The wind had found its weakness, tearing at the wood, threatening to rip it clean off its hinges. The panicked bleating of sheep and the low, nervous snorts of horses carried on the gale. Jed grabbed the coil of rope from the porch hook and plunged into the maelstrom. Rain instantly plastered his hair to his scalp, soaking through his denim jacket in seconds. He fought against the wind's invisible fists, each step a struggle. When he reached the barn, Luna was bracing her shoulder against the splintering wood, her muscles taut. Her face, slick with rain, was a mask of fierce concentration. A fresh gust ripped at the door, pulling it a foot inward, and the terrified animals within surged against their stalls. "The latch is busted," she yelled, her voice raw. Jed saw the twisted metal. Without a word, he unwound the rope, fumbling with numb fingers. "Hold it steady," he shouted back, pushing his weight alongside hers. Together, their combined strength, a silent agreement forged in the chaos, held the massive door against the wind's relentless push. He threaded the thick rope through the broken latch, around the heavy crossbeam inside, and back out, pulling it taut with all his might. Luna, seeing his intent, found a loose plank nearby and wedged it against the bottom of the door, a temporary but vital brace. With a final, grunting heave, Jed tied off the rope, securing the barn against the storm's fury. They stood there, chests heaving, soaked to the bone, watching the driving rain obscure everything beyond arm's length. The ranch was safe, for now. He looked at Luna, really looked at her, seeing not just the resilient woman but the true partner standing beside him. The wind still howled, but inside the barn, a quiet understanding had begun to bloom. A new beginning. The last embers of the storm faded, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Jed and Luna sat by a small, crackling fire, its warmth a welcome contrast to the night's fury. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but comfortable, a testament to the shared ordeal they had just overcome. Jed watched the flames dance, their rhythm mirroring the steady beat of his own heart. He glanced at Luna, her profile illuminated by the firelight, revealing a strength he had come to admire more than he could ever articulate. Her eyes, usually guarded, held a quiet contentment, reflecting the same peaceful victory he felt. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the smooth, cool stone he always carried, a small, perfectly round river rock, polished by years of tumbling downstream. He had found it as a boy, a solitary fragment of permanence in a world of change. He extended his hand, holding the stone out to her, his gaze steady and unwavering. There were no words, none were needed. His eyes, deep and earnest, held a silent question, a promise, a plea for a future he suddenly couldn't imagine without her. It was a proposal stripped of fanfare, raw and true, born of shared struggle and profound respect. Luna's eyes, wide and searching, met his. She understood. The stone, simple and unadorned, spoke volumes. It was not a trinket of wealth, but a token of his solitary heart, offered freely. A slow, radiant smile bloomed on her face, a breathtaking sight that banished the last vestiges of her guardedness. It was a smile Jed had never seen before, bright and full of a joy that reached her eyes, transforming her entire countenance. She nodded, a single, decisive movement, and gently took the stone from his palm, her fingers brushing his, sending a jolt through him. Weeks turned into months, marked by the rising and setting sun, and the steady rhythm of their labor. The lonely ranch, once a place of quiet endurance, now buzzed with purpose. Jed and Luna worked side by side, a silent, efficient partnership. The creak of the well pump, the lowing of the cattle, the distant ring of Jed's hammer on a loose fence post, these sounds were no longer echoes in an empty space but threads in the vibrant tapestry of their shared life. Luna, with her innate connection to the land, helped the garden flourish, her hands coaxing life from the soil. Jed found himself humming as he mended tack, a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in years. The house, once too quiet, now held the soft rustle of her movements, the gentle clink of dishes, the subtle scent of herbs drying. The vast, empty expanse of the plains no longer felt isolating, it was home, and they were building it, together, husband and wife.